And that leads you to our focus tonight on education with our guest, South Africa Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube. She is in Paris to attend the UNESCO Jubilee to mark the International Mothertongue Day. And this year marks the 25th anniversary. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you.
I know you're a bit advocate of teaching in local languages because you say children perform better in school when taught in their mother tongue.
Absolutely. I think what's really important is to recognize that it's not just about linguistic diversity, which of course South Africa doesn't lack any. We've got 12 official languages, but it's also about what we've seen and what the research is showing us, that children who, particularly in the foundation phase, are taught in their mother tongue often are able to grasp complex concepts and they develop cognitively quicker and better than children who are not taught in their mother tongue. And so for me, one of the biggest responsibilities that I have as a new minister in the basic education sector in South Africa is to really improve our our education outcomes. Because we've seen international benchmarking tests that show that we're not doing well when it comes to reading for meaning, particularly for children under the age of 10. And so to improve that, we've got to look at a whole basket of solutions. And one of those things is to look at how do we use mother tongue education to really reinforce cognitive abilities so that children may be able to learn other languages, but also more complex subjects.
So you said 12 languages, but unity is a key word in South Africa these days. How do you reconcile unity and all these different languages?
I think one of the great things about South Africa is that we've learned to live and embrace our diversity. And so while we have all these different languages and all these different cultures, but ultimately there is a recognition of why different languages are important and why different cultures are important. And these blend together very well. And so you will not find that kind of cultural conflict or tension. So really the view is, and this is the view that I also expressed at UNESCO today, to say that we are not saying we're replacing, for instance, English, which a lot of parents, for instance, would be nervous about saying, look, English is a universal language. We want to be able to make sure that our children are learning English. But we're saying that if you start your children, particularly at a foundation phase, from 0 to 4 in their mother tongue, and continue that for several years, they're able to grasp a second language, a third language, and learn quicker in a different language than when you immediately switch them off at a mother tongue. So it's really about the cognitive science behind it. We had neuroscientists at UNESCO today who are telling us about why these things are important. And so really in an effort to really improve education outcomes in South Africa, this is something that I really want us to pursue. And of course, as we're having the G20 presidency this year, one of the things that we are going to be focusing on is how do we as the G20 countries look at how we can share skills. And I want to make sure that South African children are able to compete globally so that they can be able to work in different places around the world. And that's really the importance and the value of being able to host the G20 in this year.
And talking about reticence, President Ramaphosa signed the Bella law, so the basic education laws, amendment bill that gives the government oversight over school language and admission policies. And the main reason for that was to prevent some children to be excluded. What do you think about that Bella bill?
I mean, I think, there are many good things about the Bella Act. It's just it's been unfortunate that it has been a divisive piece of legislation in our country. But I think that we've moved past that. And I think the government of national unity has realized that, there are going to be pieces of legislation that we may not have agreed with when we were in different sides of sort of the political aisle. But now, for instance, my role is to unite the education sector because there are 13.5 million learners who are looking to us as leaders and as policymakers and as lawmakers to lead them so that we can be able to make sure that they have better education outcomes. South Africa has been very good at making sure that we've got access to education in the past 30 years since democracy. But now is the time to talk about what is the quality of that education. And that for me is the obsession that I have. We have to be able to have quality education so that we can have a skilled workforce and grow our economy so that we can really bring down that unemployment rate.
And quality education also means funding.
Yes.
So my question would be, would all the different school with different languages would have the same funding, depending on if it's an African taught school or Xhosa or Zulu? It would have access to the same funding?
Look, I mean, the idea is really to make this equitable, because currently in South Africa, you would have English or Afrikaans-speaking children who are completely outperforming, for instance, African language-speaking children. And the reason for that is simple. It's not because these children who are African language speakers are any less smarter. The reality is that they get to school and they speak a different language at home, and they get to school and they are learning English, and they're learning through English. So what we are saying is that let's repeat the same pattern we have seen. Continue home mother tongue in conjunction with English, because we can see what the evidence shows us. So, of course, we want to be able to make sure that there will be equitable funding. Look, this, as many countries at UNESCO today admitted, this requires significant investment, and no country is going to wake up one day and have equal recognition for all languages, all the material, the teaching material, all the teachers. This is going to be gradual, but the science is showing us this is where we need to be going. And so that's certainly something that in my term I'm going to be pushing for.
And talking about money, our team in South Africa investigated the state of some schools. Let's take a look.
I remember coming home and reflecting on my day, and just reflecting on what just happened. Not having basic infrastructure of just having a toilet or clean water or just food to eat a day. That was absolutely shocking, and I believe it was just unfair to any learner that we can drive 5 minutes out of town where we are now, and we can see that different contrast.
Your reaction?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the reflection there is absolutely true. That ultimately, as I said to you, South Africa has been really good in the past 30 years in terms of providing access, but quality and equality is something that we have to strive for. And I think that now that we are at a 30-year mark, we have to ask ourselves a question. We have a new government in South Africa, a government of national unity. And I think that there are advantages of having different voices and differing voices around the decision-making table to say, how do we fund public education in the country? How do we make sure that a child from rural parts of the country has access to the same robotics and coding lessons that like a child would have in a city area? And those are the things that have to occupy our minds, because ultimately we risk we risk leaving millions of poor Black children behind if we don't equalize that playing field. And that's what policymakers and legislators have to really obsess about. And that, for me, is really my priority for the next 5 years.
All right, let's move away from education for a bit. South Africa is hosting the G20. So how important it is for South Africa to host the event?
It's huge. I mean, I think that, having a G20 being hosted by an African country for the very first time is really, really significant. I think it's not just a South African victory. I think it's also an African victory. And that's why the president has made it clear that he's also even inviting the African Union very much to be part of the G20. But I think really, for me, the marker of success of whether or not we're going to utilize this G20 well and well enough is what we managed to get out of it. Because, we've seen Brazil did a very good job of essentially really deriving a lot of value from hosting the G20. But for us, we've got a number of themes, particularly in education. We're focusing on early child learning and the importance of that. We're focusing on skills that are recognizable around the world, and we're focusing on teacher development. So for me, I think the mark of success is, do we get to the end of the year at the Leaders Summit with a declaration that leaders of the G20 can agree to, that takes us forward, that takes the world forward in the right direction? Yes, there are geopolitics in the world is the way that it is, but ultimately we've got to move on. Similarly to how Brazil had its own term, and there was the war in the Middle East, there was a war between Ukraine and Russia, and they were able to really push some reforms. And I think South Africa is going to have to also really heed that call.
Thank you very much, Minister. South Africa Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube. Thank you for joining us
Thank you.
tonight.